All right. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody on Zoom this evening. Tonight, we're here with another program in the series of fantastic nature talks in partnership with Mid-Coast Audubon. Before we get started, I will remind you that you can type your comments and questions into the chat box or the Q&A, and Will and I will read them out loud at the end. And I'm also just going to give a quick plug for next Tuesday, in which we're going to have another program with Midcoast Audubon about screech owls. So we have two this month. And now I'll turn it over to Will Broussard from Midcoast Audubon, who will tell us a little bit about the organization and
Thank you.
introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Julia. Well, thank you all for coming out on another Thursday evening. We're excited, of course, to have Dave Govatski speaking tonight. But before we get to that, I want to mention a couple other programs coming up. Next week, February 20th at 6 p.m., we have a bonus virtual program with Jim Wright, who's going to be speaking about screech owls. He's just released a book called The Screech Owl Companion. I actually got a copy of it for a friend, and it's a really awesome book. So come on out for that program, virtually, of course. And coming up later in February, we have a field trip to Clary Hill and Union. So we'll be checking out this Midcoast Conservancy land for some of our winter finches and winter sparrows at this really beautiful location. And coming up in March, we have our spring birdseed sale coming up on March 2nd. And details you can check out at midcoast.maineaudubon.org. And we'll have another field trip on Saturday, the 16th of March to Damariscotta Mills. And then about a month from now, on Thursday, the 21st of March, we'll have Michael Wojtek speaking on Zoom on the subject, the growth of trees. So that'll be very exciting. So tonight's program speaker is David Govatski. Dave's a naturalist and author. He's retired from the U.S. Forest Service. He worked for that organization for 30 years. He has worked in a number of different landscapes studying fire and fire ecology, and to this day he's maintained a strong personal interest in the field of fire ecology. So we're very excited to have Dave returning to the Midcoast series. So thank you very much, Dave.
Well, thanks, Will, and welcome everyone from Mid-Coast Audubon and guests. I'm pleased to be here tonight to talk about the Pyrocene, and I'm going to share my screen here. Here we go. So the topic of my talk is Welcome to the Pyrocene. And you're probably asking yourself, what is the Pyrocene? And I'll explain that. And I want to talk a little bit about the ecological implications of our planet, which is on fire. And I want to give credit to my former professor, Stephen Pyne, who's still teaching at Arizona State University. He's the author of 35 different books. And he came up with this title, The Pyrocene, back in 2015. It's kind of the opposite of the Ice Age, that geologic epoch that we call the Pleistocene. So Pyrocene relates to fire. Now, the other term that's often used is the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene relates to what humans have done to change the climate. And that essentially started 170 years ago with the Industrial Revolution. So Stephen Pyne I was actually working for the U.S. Forest Service, and I had to go to technical fire management school in Marana, Arizona. And so he works out of Tucson, teaches there. And so he would come up and present different courses, and he's got a lot of background, but 35 books on fire. And this is one that just came out in 2021. Maybe Julia can get a copy of it, or if you're interested, I think you can get it on Audible too. So you might like that. And Stephen's a great author, and really brings it down to pretty easy to understand. And I'm going to try to do this the same tonight, but here's some of his other books. He's probably the world's leading authority on the history of wildfire. And he's very well known throughout the world, and a lot of his books. And now in the bottom left corner, you can see one that really relates to the Northeast, including New Jersey and New York. But there's a whole chapter just on the Maine fire history, and quite interesting. And you can get these at potentially at your bookstores, or you can order it online. He has a website. So some of the objectives. So I want to introduce you to this concept of the pyrocene, and we'll talk about some of the primary factors that why are we having increased wildfires and severity in the United States, actually in Canada and throughout the world. I want to give you a little bit of a background on the prehistoric and historical background of fire use and the role of invasive plant species that we have in spreading fire. And we'll talk about some concepts like severity versus the size in how we describe fires. And fires are not necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of good things that come out of it. So there's some beneficial roles that I'll mention, and then I'll talk a little bit about forest restoration measures. So key points about the pyrocene and fire use unique to humans, and we have shaped landscapes with it for about 1 million years. Humans first harnessed fire in prehistoric times, generally coming from lightning strikes, and they realized that, wow, you could stay warm around a fire, and you could also use it to cook meals and to make clay pots and various other things like that. And for a long time in America, landscapes have been deprived of natural fire. And humans switched to using fossil fuels, and this has created some new problems with a warming planet. And I think this picture is really indicative of the situation that we're in. On the left, you have the Trans-Alaska pipeline that's bringing petroleum products from Prudhoe Bay, the same products that are leading to the problems that we have, the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And on the right, you have these forests, in this case, black spruce forests in Alaska, that are burning up. And so it's somewhat of a negative feedback loop. The more we pollute and increase the carbon dioxide levels, the more fires that we're having. Let's go back 1 million years, and I promise we won't spend a lot of time back 1 million years, but from our evidence is that Homo erectus first started using fire about 1 million years ago to harden their spear tips, to cook meals, to stay warm, and for a variety of other factors. And you might say that campfires were caveman TV. That's kind of what I think of it. And I guess maybe I'm a little bit of a caveman because I kind of like sitting around a fire and talking with friends and looking into it and watching it. So the History Channel had a great article about how human ancestors tamed fire. This is at the Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, about 1 million years ago, that we can trace the history back, and potentially even longer. So just amazing about that. And we do know that indigenous cultures, including our own Abenaki or Wabanaki people that we have in the Northeast, used it for agricultural purposes, for hunting, to improve their ability to travel. Um, we don't know for sure, but we think that they were wanting to reduce the risk of large fires. They wanted to reduce the tick problems and other insect problems. And they knew about improving habitat for game animals and increasing berry production. And we know in Maine in particular that fires and blueberries go hand in hand. And they probably had some religious and cultural use of fire. So there was that history. How extensive it was tends to be more along the coast where you're at, and along the rivers where I am at, where the activities would be going on. So this cultural use went on for a long, long time, and it was only since the Euro-Americans came in and that we decided that fire was a bad thing. Um, in that we told the native peoples that they couldn't use fire. Well, this is completely reversed, by the way, so I'll cut to the chase on that, is that we're working with indigenous tribes, particularly out west, but also in the south and elsewhere to restore fire to the ecosystem. The controversy is this, when the first settlers came in, they cut the trees down and they burned the land and they wanted to nourish the soil with ash. They wanted to make soap out of potash and so we had a lot of fire going on. In the southeastern United States, fire was widely accepted for a long, long time, and today this is where most of the prescribed burning is going on in the southern U.S. However, there were events that occurred. The Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin, in Door County, Wisconsin in 1899, killed over 2,500 people. And it was an event that, really seared a memory into the American public. The newspaper coverage of the entire town of Peshtigo with 600 people, all but one person died. And so with 2,500 people, that was just terrible. And in 1910, the big blowup in Idaho, Montana, and Washington, it just created a call for fire suppression. So the U.S. Forest Service, which was essentially founded in 1905, came up with a policy that they told the forest rangers that you had to put the fires out by 10 a.m. in the morning of the next day. So that was the 10 a.m. policy, and this was, on for many, many years. And even when I started working with the Forest Service way back in 1970 on a fire tower in Colorado, we still had that 10 a.m. policy. So here's what the big blow up looked like, and again, it was a wind-driven fire. You can see they're fairly linear, going from west to east. Um, and the fires just raged across Washington and Oregon and Idaho and into Montana. So huge fire, 3 million acres. 87 people died. The famous forest ranger Ed Pulaski kept his men in this mining tunnel that you see and just left the center, and he put a blanket over the entrance. And these big trees were burning up, and a number of his men went, crazy and just ran out and they burned up, and others perished even in that tunnel, but most of them survived. And he's credited to inventing a tool called Pulaski that is still in use today in Maine and New Hampshire, throughout the country, and in many cases throughout the world. It's a combination of an axe and a hoe that you can use for chopping and you can use for grubbing. So the European Americans viewed fire as, kind of an evil thing, and we had to go to war against it. In the 1930s, we had unlimited manpower with the Civilian Conservation Corps, so they would readily attack fires wherever they were, and they were very helpful. A number of CCC corpsmen were killed fighting fires, but it really was able to put out the fires fairly quickly because there were camps all over the country with 200 men that were trained and ready to go. So that was a big effort. And after World War II, we had all of this surplus military equipment. This is kind of a staged demonstration here. You see some old military jeeps, and you see helicopters and dozers. And again, it was this total war on fire. You still see some horses in there, and we still use horses and mules. I've worked with them in the past in various Western states. Uh, but again, it was this fire industrial complex, and we had all of these materials, whether it was torpedo bombers here that would carry fire retardant or whatever. And we pretty well thought that we could we could control fires, and that led to some issues. So in Smokey Bear, we actually had a Smokey Bear before the first cub was rescued on the Lincoln National Forest in 1950. Um, we had earlier symbols. We actually had Bambi that we borrowed from Disney, that was on fire prevention posters. And then in 1944, we came up with this idea of a Smokey the Bear. And so we've got that, and the evolution came through, and it just trying to appeal to America, a patriotic way that burn timber builds no homes, and so forth. So there's every year they came out with new posters and trying to appeal to our efforts to prevent forest fires, because prevention, of course, is usually better than uh, having to deal with the fires. Now, here's one that came out of Wisconsin in 1953. It's you. Some of you probably remember the Cold War, and the Red Scare, and various things going on. So here's an interesting poster. It's a red we can all fight. So from the state of Wisconsin. So Smokey had his ABCs, and as you can see, his physique changed, the way he looked, and there are various artists that came through, but probably one of the most effective advertising campaigns that ever came out was Smokey Bear, and is still around, and in some cases is certainly still appropriate. But the question is it time to replace Smokey's shovel with a drip torch? This firefighter here is carrying a drip torch to do prescribed burning and walking actually on a fire line. In case I don't mention it, but what a fire line is, it's a break between the fuel that's burning and that is unburned, and it's typically scraped down the mineral soil, and that's the purpose. This is a burn in the southern United States. And before I get too far on fire, and this will not be on the quiz, but there won't be a quiz actually. I wanted to talk about the fire behavior triangle. So just you get an idea on wildland fire. I spent a good part of my career in fire and aviation management. So I, went to schools all over the country, but it was mostly the School of Hard Knocks. And we learned about the fire behavior triangle. That's one of the basic things you do. It's fuel, weather, and topography, and how they interact with fires. So I wanted to mention we have different classifications of fuels: light fuels, heavy fuels. Light fuels, typically grass, leaves, and shrubs. And those heavier fuels can be trees, logs, stumps, and I hate to say it, even buildings can be heavy fuels. And we measure fuel in a couple different ways. One is by the amount of moisture content in a particular fuel. And we can also measure the quantity of fuels in a given area, and that's called fuel loading. And we're able to do that through various calculations. So we have these, and you don't have to remember this, but just to know that we classify fuels in four different measures: 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, and 1,000 hour fuels. Now, what you need to know is that in the case of a 1 hour fuel, it takes about an hour for something that's wet to dry out and become a 1 hour fuel. In that case, let's just say it's leaves and grass in the spring and the fall. 1,000 hour fuels would be those logs. It's going to take 1,000 hours for a log that's lying on a forest floor to dry out. So this is a very common spring fire fuel and dry grass. And so this would be a 1 hour fuel. And we have typically in Maine and the Northeast, we have 3 different times a year that we have fires that go. And one is right as the snow goes in the springtime. We have this dry grass that's matted down, and we have lots of sun, lots of wind, and it dries up quick. And we get these spring grass fires that just take off and go really, really quick. And then it greens up, and you wait until summer, and usually in July or August, if you have a drought, you could potentially have those other fuels. So smaller logs and then bigger logs that are drying out. And that's the second time of the year. We'll call it August, where during a drought, you could have some forest fires. And then the final one is typically in October, but lately it's been going into November, um, where you have dry leaves from our deciduous trees, or maples and beeches and birch trees that drop their leaves. You get in the fall, and you get the wind whipping through, and you get the sun shining through because the leaves aren't on the trees, and you get these fall burns. So those are the three times a year. The second factor after fuel is weather. And this is basic fire weather. So if you have winds that are above 15 miles an hour, your humidity is below 35% relative humidity, and your temperature typically above 80 degrees, and you haven't had precipitation for, say, 15 days, and you're in a drought condition, um, and you might have some unusual factors like a thermal belt or a notch effect, where you get these unusual winds. And again, depending on the time of the year, as I said, we have these three different uh, conditions during these different times of the year for the burns. So the topography really affects it. And I'll get into that thermal belt issue. Oh, sorry, I just hit the wrong button here. Hold on. Going back here. So topography, again, a key thing. The slope, obviously, if the fire is burning at the bottom of a slope and it's going up a steep hill, it's going to burn really fast because it's preheating the fuels in front of it. Again, is the fire on the top of the ridge, in the middle, or in the bottom? Aspect relates to, where the sun is essentially shining on it. So we typically see the south sides of hillsides. They tend to be drier, and they tend to be sunnier. And even our geology has something to do with it. The way our glaciers came through, coming in from the northwest and north, they typically would ride over the tops of our hills. And then on the south side, um, they would often pluck rocks away. And so if you look around, you'll see many of the cliffs are south facing, and those things have a tendency to be much drier, much hotter, and they collect leaves in the rocks. And so those can be really tough places to fight fires. Now, a thermal belt is on the middle third of a mountain, and it's often the place when we uh, think about putting in an apple orchard, we don't put it in the valleys, because we often find valleys to be cold air sinks, and the mountaintops tend to be cold and windier. So often our orchards are in the middle third of the mountain, where it's consistently drier and warmer and less opportunity for these extremes. And so thermal belt fire activity, particularly at night, these fires can burn uh, pretty strong in the middle of the night. I've spent many a night in New England, Maine, and New Hampshire, and elsewhere, working on these fires where thermal belt activity is very strong. So let's go back and take a look at some of the fires. Maine is certainly it's the most heavily forested state in the country at 90% forest cover. You're very fortunate that you have the Maine Forest Service, and you have local fire departments that are well equipped, well trained, and well experienced in managing fires. But you still can have fires that do pop up. And here's a Baxter State Fire in 1977, where 3,000 acres burned in this premier state park of the state of Maine. The year Maine burned, October 1947. This is a picture of a fire in North Kennebunkport. After 90 days of drought and very high temperatures, those fires started. In some cases, they were from people burning trash, and various other causes. But 220,000 acres of Maine burned. And if you get the right conditions, no matter how many firefighters you have and the equipment that you have, they can burn through. And I'll talk more about that. So here's a map. This is the the fire outbreak in that October of 1947. And you can see that the Brownfield fire up near Freiburg, 21,000 acres, Shapley fire, 109,000 acre fire, and various smaller fires around. And then you go all the way over to Bar Harbor and down East Maine. And we all remember the Bar Harbor fire and how disastrous that was to all of the homes and facilities at what is now Acadia National Park. So Maine has had its share of fires, and it really depends on the habitat that you have. The fire fuel types, whether it's pitch pine or jack pine um, or what other forest types you have. So let's take a look at California. I want to go around a little bit around the world. I could spend a lot of time, but I'm going to pick on California here because California is somewhat unique. It's got a southern part of the state. It's a Mediterranean climate, but it does have a changing climate. And these warmer temperatures are drying out fuels. They're having much shorter winters, although this winter is an exception. And the fire season is longer. We used to be able to say that, a fire, we'd have these fires in California, Southern California in October, but now they're going November, December, January, all the way through. There's more people that are moving into the forest. They're getting into what we call the wildland urban interface. You have more power lines, and power lines have been a known cause for fires when you get these strong Santa Ana winds coming through, and there's more people recreating in the woods. So that's a problem. Fire suppression. A lot of people like to blame the buildup of biomass or fuels as a result of fire suppression. And in many cases, that is correct because we have gone and suppressed fires instead of allowing some fires to burn naturally. And of course, you have these unique conditions, and you have these in different parts of the country throughout the West. Oregon has them, Washington has them. But in California, you get these Santa Ana and the Diablo winds, and these are these downslope winds. We sometimes call them katabatic winds that they can exceed 70 miles an hour and dry out the vegetation in front of them. And I remember, vividly, I'd be, in my tent after being out all day on the fire line, and be 11 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden my tent would just be shaking when these 40, 50 mile an hour winds, and I'd crawl out of my tent and look up in the mountainside, and it's Santa Ana winds have come and just blowing the fires downhill. So the question is, and I don't have an answer because it's actually part of both. Is it climate change or is it a problem of forest management? And it's a complicated topic, and there is no simple, easy answer. Otherwise, we would have come up with it, and we're trying to deal with it today. So the wildland urban interface is of course a problem. More people moving into areas that burn. I've been on fires in places in California like every 3 years, and some of the houses are still under construction from the last fire, and they burn up. It's because of that Mediterranean climate. You get the strong winds and dry conditions, and the fires just take off. And because of the fact that we have a lot of insect-killed forest in the wildland urban interface, and in the backcountry for that matter too, that these trees with those dead trees, they're dead needles, they just can really take off. So what we try to work with people is that you have to have a defensible space, and it really depends on a lot of factors, and that's why the various states have trained people that go and try to mitigate the problems that are around there. And and one of the things when we're managing these large fires, we're seeing a million or $2 million home burning every minute or two. And so you have to make a decision because you have limited resources. Which homes and properties are you going to try to protect, and which ones that are just not defensible? So those people that have these defensible space around there, you're going to tend to want to make a stand there. But life safety is first, then homes, and then property, and then of course the forest. The biggest reason that homes burn, it's not the actual flames impinging on the houses. It's the embers that go into the cracks and the soffits and get underneath the house and catch the house on fire. So it looks like a snowstorm when you're actually in these situations here and you're trying to deal with 50, 60 mile-an-hour winds, and these embers are just blowing everywhere. So that's really the reason why homes catch on fire and burn. And you get certain conditions, these pyrocumulus clouds, you get these winds that, are just going up. You're actually getting lightning out of these things. And then you get these downdrafts, and just these downdrafts, if you're around them and you're a firefighter, you can feel them because they're coming down at 60, 70 miles an hour and just blowing the fire across the fire lines in all directions. And so you just have to be really careful. And that's why our leadership gets a lot of training in fire weather and fire behavior. And we actually have specialists that advise on these larger fires. It's the smaller fires where you often run into problems with people getting overrun by fires because there's not a staff that's looking out over them and keeping watch. So here's part of the problem. And this goes back, 1831 to 2023. That's almost 200 years that we have records. And so this is the mean average, mean temperature. It's going up. And again, this is part of what we consider to be climate change. Some people say it's not man-caused. I actually believe it is because of the burning of fossil fuels. But we can see that the temperature is going up. The scale on the right, you're probably more familiar with, is the Fahrenheit scale. And you can see that there's been a lot of changes over time, and particularly as we're going up here. So that's why the fire seasons are getting longer. And just as a side note, I have a couple of friends who they do driveways, they plow driveways. They're spending more time and money now buying sanding equipment because we're getting more freezing rain than we're getting snow, even here where I am in the White Mountains. And again, this is the western states. What we're looking at, the number of fires are going up. Partially, that's because of the increasing temperature that's happening. So it's a major factor that we're aware of. And then you get these storms, you get these really dry conditions, and you get lightning storms, and there's no rain, little or no rain. The rain, it's so dry out there. It's called virga. It does not even hit the ground. And so here's a dry, we call them these a bust. When you get thousands of strikes in the matter of a day. And so what are you going to do? This is in 2020. We had 7,833 lightning strikes in 24 hours. And this was in an area that had been in extreme drought for over a decade. And so what happens is the fires just take off. And I did a screenshot here. This is Riverside, California, in the southern part near the Cleveland National Forest. And you can just see what the conditions were like. You can't imagine it being in the Camden Rockport area, but imagine a temperature high of 118 degrees, winds gusting to 45 miles an hour, and the humidity is below 15%. So it's very, very difficult. And so under some of these extreme conditions, you just can't control fire. So what you have to do, and if you're in that area, it's if you have red flag warning and that you need to have your gear packed, and even with defensible space, you may not be able to keep your house there. So one of the problems is that we have invasive plants or exotic plants that are in our areas. And one of them is eucalyptus trees. There's a number of eucalyptus species that have been put in California, Hawaii, other places like that. They're very, very fast growing, but they're just full of oils and resins, and they take off. They shed their bark and leaves, and it releases a flammable gas that is it's like gasoline exploding. And so if you're dealing with fires in a eucalyptus forest, it's pretty bad. So eucalyptus, of course, is a native, several different native species in Australia, where they have problems over there too. And the other big invasive, and there's several of them, cheatgrass. It's a very, very aggressive invasive species from Eurasia, highly flammable. It tends to dry out or cure in July, and it, it replaces the native plants, and then it reseeds because it likes fire, and so it's covered, tens of millions of acres of Intermountain West, and it doesn't look like it's gonna, burn a tree down, but what happens is this cheatgrass catches on fire, and then it goes to a tree like a juniper or a pine. It gets the lower branches, and then it goes up into the trees and just takes off. And these fires can rip along at very, very fast, faster than you can run, in some cases. And I've had a fair amount of experience in dealing with fires and cheatgrass, and they're not pretty. And again, it's an invasive that just tends to really spread around. So in 2020 in California, 4.3 million acres burned up. So a devastating year. That was, and then of course we had all the fires in Oregon and Washington, and the other Western states and Minnesota and elsewhere. That was the worst, I guess, in North American history of the year 2020. And particularly in California, it was especially bad. Lots of structures lost, lots of fatalities, unfortunately. And I think we all remember the campfire near Paradise, California, 85 dead. People were just trapped. They couldn't get down the roads, and you can see the molten aluminum from the wheels, and just a terrible situation. And it was so bad that year. The fires were burning in the wine country, and you can see here the result. A lot of the grape crop for wine production was lost because of these terrible fires. That year, and of course in the southern hemisphere, we had the Australian bushfires. 46 million acres burned, and lots of animals were lost. Kangaroos and wallabies and koalas, and you name it, was lost. So devastating to Australia and the people there and the wildlife. And that same year, 47 million acres burned in Siberia and Russia. Um, and there's so few people living there that they don't even put the fires out, and they just keep going. So let's talk about last year, and seems like such a long time ago, but last summer, 5% of Canada burned, and 45.7 million acres of Canada burned. Every province, our neighboring provinces in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, even Prince Edward Island had fires, and Quebec had fires. So 6 times the long-term average for Canada, well above the normal. And Canada has, what, 38 million people compared to 330 plus million people here. So we had major air quality issues here in Canada and the US, and actually even into Europe. And the worst thing, in some ways, was that it released 2 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere, which again is contributing to the problem. So you get into this negative feedback loop, and lots of loss of wildlife. So a little bit on carbon monoxide concentrations, and you can see here how bad it was and very unhealthy for the population. New York City seemed to get it really bad, and a lot of times along the coast of Maine, you get these accumulations of air pollutants that are coming in just for the peculiar nature that we have on the seacoast. So air quality, top left picture, Statue of Liberty, New York skyline on the bottom left, and the Empire State Building. And people with asthma or young people that don't have asthma that can be uh, get asthma from some of these things. I mean, it's pretty bad, and I think we all remember that uh, being outside and not being able to see the hills and the mountains, and you can actually smell the smoke, and smoke was going down as far as Miami, Florida, and into Europe from what was burning. In August, we had the fires in Lahaina and Hawaii. And you're probably saying, well, Hawaii, for those that haven't been there, you expect that it's kind of a tropical rainforest, but it is typically on one half on one side, but one side is really dry. And because they don't do agriculture in the ways they used to do, um, with cultivated fields and growing pineapples and so forth, you have a lot of plants that are not native to the area that have come in. You have a lot of power lines, and you do get these very strong winds come through. And so in a matter of hours, it burned this lovely community to ashes and left about 100 dead there. I was out there this year, and I could just see that these conditions are going to be there. And so it's going to be a tough situation for Hawaii being an island. They can't get the same kind of help that we can get in our areas here from other support. In the last couple of weeks, you've probably been reading about Chile is on fire. Again, a Mediterranean climate, again, problems with eucalyptus and some other invasive species, problems in Argentina with fires, also fires in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. So it's a major problem right now. We're in winter, they're in summer, and 135 people were killed in Chile just a week or two ago. So very tragic situation over there. They're dealing with it, and it's similar to what's going on in Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Turkey. I mean, even Sweden and Finland, the Scandinavian countries, where you wouldn't expect fires to be occurring. So again, it's part of that warming of the climate. You're getting trees that are stressed, you're getting drought conditions, and so it's a problem. So there's a lot of concern about this. This is a survey that was done last year. This is actually a survey that was conducted by the Nature Conservancy, and they've been doing this survey for a number of years. And the concern about wildfires is now up to 69%, and this is across the United States of America. So a lot of people are very concerned about wildfire, not just people like myself that have had a career in dealing with it. So we often talk about size as the fire, and I mentioned earlier 3 million acres or 220,000 acres what. And so sometimes we classify the fires, mega fires, as 100,000 acres up to 1 million acres. And I've been on a number of these what are called mega fires. I spent a summer of '88 in Yellowstone National Park on those fires, and we had 5 major fires that burned over 1 million acres there. And now we're actually getting in the what are called gigafires, over 1 million acres in size. But it's probably a little bit misleading. And I remember the newscast they're talking about 100,000 acres destroyed. Well, in some cases, a lot of cases, I mean, that was a little bit of hyperbole. So it really depends on the severity, because it's more like a quilt on the landscape. So you get these different degrees, these mixed severity fires. And here's an example here. Top left, low severity fires. And, in many ways, this is going to be somewhat beneficial for the forest and even those patches of medium burn fires. Now, the high severity fires, different story. Entire trees are burning up and the organic layer of the soils are often exposed. These high severity fires, greater than 75% tree mortality. In some cases in California, it was nearly 100% mortality, including trees like the giant sequoia that have been around for 2,000 years and stand 200 plus feet tall, have died from these extensive fires. And you get this mineral exposure and mineral soil exposure. And so what you end up and when autumn comes around, you get these rains that start in November, and then you get these mud flows and other things. And so the quality of the soil is depleted, and the streams are covered in ash, and the aquatic life that's there is pretty bad. So those are certainly really bad, but in a lot of cases it's less severe. So you get these mosaics, and that's probably a healthier thing, even the low and moderate severity. So we are, working, nationwide, but probably not enough, and too little, too late. But the South is doing a lot of work in longleaf uh, pine areas. This is a species that was heavily harvested for forest products, but we're trying to get more of these to come back, and we're burning at intervals of 3 to 5 years to keep the understory vegetation down and to make these forests better. You can look up, the longleaf pine stories, but there's different stages of the tree life, and here's a picture of the grass stage coming up here. But this is what the forest should be looking like. This was on the Ecological National Forest in northern Florida, one of my favorite national forests. Um, here's what I wanted to show you here. This is the grass stage of longleaf pine. And you can see why these leaves or needles are really, that's why they call them longleaf, and a very important tree species in the South for a number of wildlife species. And one of them is the red-cockaded woodpecker, uh, a threatened species, and it needs to have uh, longleaf pine to be able to put its nesting cavities in. Um, it often will, make this hole and allow the sap to come around. So the sap keeps the snakes, the rat snakes and the bull snakes, from getting into the cavities and eating the young. Uh, I worked on fires in the South, in Georgia, in the Okefenokee Swamp of all places, in Florida, and had a chance to work with some of the biologists out there as resource advisors. And I'd go out in the evenings and check out the red-cockaded woodpeckers. Always interested me to learn more about them. So here's, the intent on prescribed burning. It's to keep that understory vegetation down, and so you just have the proper density of larger trees that you want to keep. This is on the Oconee National Forest in Georgia. Uh, Longleaf pine. This is what it looks like after 3 to 4 years, and this is the natural state if you just had lightning fires coming through. So this is what we're trying to do, whether it's Nature Conservancy or state agencies in Maine or New Hampshire, or the Forest Service or the National Park Service, or even private individuals, is to try to restore a fire to the ecosystem where needed. It's tricky though, because if you have an escaped fire, you get sued. There's currently a case in Oregon, in the Malheur, where a prescribed burn boss, um, part of it is a political situation in that part of Oregon, where he was arrested for having a fire escape. They quickly, put it out. It was only a few acres, but they're trying to make a statement in that particular part of Eastern Oregon. Here in Central Oregon, where I used to work on the Deschutes National Forest near Sisters in Bend, Oregon, we have ponderosa pine forest, and we were doing the same thing where, you want to have a certain density of trees, but you want to burn the understory because you get a wildfire coming in here and there's not a lot of fuel to burn. And so that is the intent, is to reduce the fuel accumulations, especially around, you can't do it everywhere. But if you can do it around those high risk communities and focus on that, and that you'll have a much better chance of having these communities and these homes surviving wildfires in the past. So even in New Hampshire and Maine, there's a lot of fire management that goes on in the pitch pine barrens. You have a couple of really good ones in your area, but here's one. I just happen to have the plan for the Ossipee pine barrens that Nature Conservancy is working on. And essentially, the value of them, it's again a fire dependent ecosystem. There's pitch pine and scrub oak woodlands. In our case, it's the largest intact pine barren. And there's a lot of rare natural communities present and species. And typically on these sandy outwash sites, and fire and disturbance is a key factor in their persistence. And so what we're trying to do, and I'm on the TNC board in New Hampshire, we're trying to restore and maintain 1,500 to 2,000 acres of pitch pine scrub oak habitat, just like you're doing in the pitch pine barrens with Maine Nature Conservancy. Here's the pitch pine, what it looks like. You're probably pretty familiar from the pitch pine that you have in Midcoast, Maine. Pitch pine cones, they're called serotinous. You may not be familiar with that term. Serotiny, from the Latin for late. It means that these cones tend to be persistent for many, many years. You can see the more recent ones that are brown and some that are actually a kind of a grayish color. These cones will stay on the trees for 20, 25 years, and you need a lot of heat to open them up, and or about 10 seconds in the microwave if you need to get the seeds. But anyways, that's pitch pine, and that's one of the characteristics of these fire dependent ecosystems. So if you're going to lose your pitch pine if you don't have these prescribed burns, getting enough heat to open up these cones. The Western equivalent, where I was at Yellowstone and other places, is lodgepole pine. Pitch pine needles, they don't rot like a lot of other needles, very flammable. And so again, it's another one of those adaptations where you build up this fuel bed underneath the tree, and it creates a lot of heat when it burns, because it will eventually burn. And so that's what opens up the cones, and the cones open fairly quickly. And I've been in fires that are still smoking, and it's like a snowstorm of seeds coming off onto the ashes, and it's just a perfect seed bed for pitch pine. Another adaptation that pitch pine has is that it does epicormic sprouting. A fire can come through and it will actually resprout from the stump. It'll resprout from the limbs, and even resprout from the trunk of the tree. So pretty amazing tree. Pitch, of course, has a lot of resins in it, burns readily, and it was used by the colonists for torches. And associated with pitch pine is this scrub oak, or Quercus ilicifolia. These tend to get to be about 4 feet tall, maybe 5 feet tall, and so they're closely associated with it. And so again, there's a number of species that like the acorns from scrub oak, also called bear oak. That's important. And another species that you have, I think I took this, I know where this one, Little Loss Island, north of Bar Harbor on the coast. This is a Nature Conservancy tract, but there's a lot of jack pine there on the rocky ridges. And you can see a couple cones. The green cones are this year's cone, the brown cones, a little bit older, and there's probably some gray cones in the background. Again, serotinous cone, It's like a waxy coating, and once you get a fire coming through, those cones will just open right up and drop the seeds into that ash and create a new forest, a phoenix type of a forest. So some of the rare fauna that we have, and you would have this on your pitch pine barrens in Maine. We've got the whippoorwill, nighthawk, the towhee, the prairie warbler, the brown thrasher, one of my favorite birds, vesper sparrow, lots of rare moth species, and the smooth green snake, just to name a few. And of course, here's our eastern whippoorwill, be coming back here in just 2, 3 months, I guess. Um, I, we have them in our backyard here, and I'm sure you have them where you're at in the area. And of course, the common nighthawk, which is again one of my favorite birds. So, in closing, this is a quote from a fire ecologist, Edwin Komarek, and the earth born in fire, baptized by lightning since before life's beginning, has been and is a fire planet. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my talk on Welcome to the Pyrocene, an introduction to forest, and I'll stop sharing my screen and see if we have any questions.
Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating.
Well,
And
thanks, Julia.
yeah, anybody with questions, type them in the chat or Q&A. I'll start off. I have a question. So with these prescribed burns, what measures are put in place to ensure that it doesn't become a severe fire? Or how much are you like you get to a place where you're really confident, this is only going to do what we want it to do? Or is it all kind of like, well, who knows?
Well, it's pretty carefully planned out, and the people that conduct the prescribed burns are specifically trained, and you have to have a certain number of people that are present depending on the complexity of the burn that you're going to be doing. And you also have to, consider various things like sensitive communities. So if you have smoke that's going to be coming in, and you know that the modeling that you have is going to have a lot of smoke in a town, for instance, that's probably not going to be a good thing. So you have to reconsider the parameters that you're going to do there. So, how often do fires escape? Prescribed fires escape and become major conflagrations? Well, too many, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
You can probably have 99.9% of the fires that stay within prescription. And it's those bigger fires. There was one in New Mexico a year or two ago that burned a couple 100,000 acres, national forest. And what happened was it was a holdover fire from the previous year. It they basically, the Forest Service had prepared these huge piles, burn piles they're called, and they burned them in November and December, and then there were embers that were still in there that lasted for 3 or 4 months, and they took off and caused just an amazing amount of damage, terrible damage. People died and that. So, the Forest Service will get sued. They'll be in court, and you definitely become very unpopular pretty quickly on that. So you have to be careful. But and so there's other people that are, opposed to it because of the smoke. But the question is, you either pay now or you pay later. And when they try to do it in a prescribed manner, hopefully you'll have less smoke and less problems than in a case of a wildfire.
Hmm.
So it's the plans are very, very complex for each burn, and they try to have as many people as possible. But human labor is expensive, and so that's why you have these interagency groups of whether it's Maine Forest Service, local fire departments, and Nature Conservancy, and trained volunteers getting together and getting their resources all together so that they can work together. And even universities, University of Maine, University of New Hampshire, they've got people that come out and get experience doing that.
Hmm.
Good question.
So we have a question from Rachel that kind of dovetails from what you were just talking about. Rachel says, I am interested in doing a prescribed burn in my very wet field and seeding fireweed. Who can I learn how to do this from? And do I need to hire someone?
One of the easiest ways, that's a good question. I would get with your local fire department and to see if they would be willing to come out and to do some practice. You may have a volunteer fire department, for instance, and maybe give them $50 and they I've done that on my property, and they enjoy doing that. I would contact the Maine Forest Service and get some advice from them. They might be able to assist, and I would also get University of Maine Extension and their forestry educators and ask if for help on that. So oftentimes in the spring that we have these, spring burns. The farmers used to burn their fields all the time, and they didn't have problems, but they often would have their neighboring farmers and friends come over and help. So it goes on, and it's generally pretty healthy for the grassland communities to do that. And I think Rachel said fireweed.
Mhm.
Yeah, yep. That's one of my favorite flowers.
It's beautiful.
I don't know why.
Yeah, we have a couple
I actually
questions.
plant it wherever I can. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a
Yeah.
couple comments just saying, great program, thank you. That was great presentation, good info, great slides.
Well, thank you.
Um,
I appreciate
yeah,
that.
yeah.
It's a
Well,
complicated topic. Hopefully I didn't go over anyone's head.
no, I learned a lot. Rachel asks, did you know fireweed is a delicious tea?
It is.
Cool.
She's a kindred soul.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
I have
fireweed
another
actually
question.
is quite interesting, and just the way that it goes to seed, that it starts at the bottom and then goes to top. You get these little parachutes coming out of it. So uh, after the 1988 wildfires at Yellowstone, I went back the next year and the year after, and you'd have these hillsides of the lodgepole pine that were just charcoal essentially, but it was just purple from
Oh,
the
wow.
fireweed.
Huh.
Epilobium angustifolium, I think it's called, for the scientific name. Just lovely. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, you must have had quite the experiences on these fires throughout the years. I mean, that sounds
Yeah. Sometimes more
pretty,
interesting than others.
yeah,
I bet.
I made
yeah,
it through. Yeah.
yeah. I had another question, kind of a technical question. On some of the maps that you showed, showing, where fires were during, say, like the big blow up or something.
Yep.
I noticed, like, it's not contiguous. So is this like embers flying through the air for many miles and lighting up another part of the state? Or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll answer it in two ways. Those were mostly lightning strikes
Oh,
in the
okay.
northern Rocky Mountains. About 90% of the fires are lightning strikes, and again, it's like I showed you the picture of the bust in Northern California with 7,000 lightning strikes. So you'll get that there. I also showed a picture of a fire that had a pyrocumulus cloud, and that's where you get these tremendous updrafts that are going in. They're carrying pine cones, they're carrying branches that are on fire, and they can go for a long, long ways. And on that particular pyrocumulus cloud, it just looked like it was a big cauliflower or a big mushroom. But sometimes you get them looking like they're anvil shaped. And those are the really nasty ones, lightning bolts coming out of them. But the anvil is carrying a lot of this material and just dropping it. It'll drop it a mile or more ahead of the main fire. So you can get these spot fires, we call them, that are way ahead of the main
Yeah.
fire. And they just, again, it builds up these individual fires, and so you end up creating a firestorm because there's multiple little spots that are burning together, and those can be pretty devastating.
Hmm.
But the big burn in 1910, that was mostly lightning strikes.
Okay.
Kelly has a question. She asked, my son wanted to understand why that woodpecker relies on the fire in its habitat.
Yeah, the main reason is that it's fairly specific for lodgepole pine. And so to keep the lodgepole pine coming in as opposed to having other species and other vegetation where you get this, younger trees that are coming in and the branches go all the way through, what that does is create a fuel ladder so that the fire can get into the tops of the trees. That would kill the longleaf pine, and so you would lose the forest. And so what you want to do is to keep that understory vegetation down by burning 3 to 5 year intervals so that you don't have a fuel ladder that just goes up to the tops of the trees and creates it. And in some cases, you get other species that move in that are not suitable for the red cockaded woodpecker. You get other kinds of pine. You get quite a few different hardwoods that come in also. So it's not the ideal habitat for that species, and also some of the other species, including indigo snakes and other things like that.
Another comment saying, great presentation, very informative. Thank you. And a question asking, are you aware of some birds spreading fire, kites, for example?
I have not heard of a bird carrying carrying fire. Of course, we have the mythical phoenix bird, but no, I haven't. If you have an idea, send
Intriguing.
the information in to Julia or Will, and I'd love
Yeah.
to hear about it.
Yeah,
Let us know what you know.
I saw that
But
question and I did a quick Google search, and it looks like there are birds, the black kites of northern Australia, that actually will move fire to areas in search for prey, and they'll actually use fire to move prey around so they can hunt
So
it.
we're not
well,
the
there
only
you
animals
go.
who use fire.
We're not the only animal. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
That's fascinating.
Oh, that's great. Great comment. Appreciate that. I always learn from these presentations, and so I appreciate you bringing that up. We do have a couple species here of seeing we're an Audubon group. We have the black-backed woodpecker and the American three-toed woodpecker. Primarily the black-backed that will often home in on these burned areas after a fire. It some of these insects put out pheromones that can attract some of these woodpeckers, and I've been on areas, and particularly in Oregon where I used to live. You'd have if you're looking for woodpeckers like white-headed woodpecker, blackback, three-toed, various other things, you'd stop at the Forest Service office wherever you had a fire, say 3 years ago that I can get to, and that's where all the woodpeckers would be. So kind of neat to see that. But you'll also get that here in Maine and New Hampshire.
That's great.
Yeah. All right. If there's no more questions, I suppose we'll wrap up.
Well, thanks everyone for listening to a somewhat of a complicated topic, and I hope I left you with some information so that you can think more about it and potentially get some of those books at the Camden
Yes, I know. I'm
Library.
gonna check out to see, what books we do have, if any, on the topic, and
Yeah,
and
Stephen
request a
Pyne is
couple
a
of
great
those.
author, and it's a fascinating topic, and we have to do more to protect our environment and to be able to, exist with nature
Yeah.
and with the problems that we're facing today. So again, thank you, and
Thank you so
get out
much,
there
David.
and
Thank
go
you,
birding.
Will.
Yeah, thank you,
Yes.
David. Great to see you again.
Yes, good to see you all. Yeah,
Have a great summer.
yeah, you too. Bye now.
Bye,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.